It was one of those days where everything felt like routine, nothing out of the ordinary on the surface, but underneath, I couldn't shake a gnawing feeling. Melissa had been in and out of the house more frequently these past few months, attending real estate seminars, client meetings, and networking events. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. 15 years of marriage, 2 kids, and a steady rhythm between us. We'd built a life together in our quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Philadelphia. But something was off. I remember the first time it hit me, just a small thing at first. Melissa had been more guarded with her phone, which wasn't like her. She used to leave it on the kitchen counter without a second thought, sometimes even forgetting it at home. But recently, it was glued to her. She'd take it with her everywhere, bedroom, bathroom, even just to go out to the garden. I hadn't thought much of it initially. People get more attached to their devices. But then came the late-night texting. It was around 11:30 p.m. one evening. I'd been going over some blueprints for a construction project when I noticed the faint glow of her phone lighting up her face. She was texting someone, but as soon as I entered the room, she lowered the phone slightly, almost instinctively, as though she didn't want me to see. I didn't say anything at the time. What was there to say? But I felt a shift, a strange distance forming between us. She had always been the vibrant one, the one with the big ideas and the charm that could win anyone over in a heartbeat. I suppose that's why she excelled in real estate. I always admired that about her, how she could juggle a career, our kids, and still find time for us. But lately, she seemed more detached. When she was home, she was often preoccupied, constantly glancing at her phone or responding to texts at odd hours. "Who was that?" I'd ask, trying to keep my tone casual. "Oh, just someone from work," she'd reply with a dismissive smile, her eyes already back on the screen. I let it go again and again. Maybe I didn't want to seem paranoid, didn't want to be the insecure husband who questions everything. But 3 months of this? The missed dinners, the nights out for work that stretched longer than they used to, and the gradual disappearance of intimacy between us. It was getting harder to ignore. Then came the trip to New York. She'd been talking about this real estate seminar for weeks, how it was a big deal for her to network with other industry professionals. I'd been supportive, of course. We all need to grow in our careers, and I wanted her to feel empowered in her work. But when the day finally came, something felt wrong. Everything packed. I asked her the night before the trip, watching as she zipped up her suitcase. "Yep," she said, barely looking up. "Just finishing a few last-minute things." She was unusually quiet that evening, as though she was thinking about something else entirely. I watched her move about the room, checking her phone every so often. My suspicions, which had been simmering in the back of my mind for weeks, began to bubble up again. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it, but my gut wouldn't let it go. Later that night, after she had gone to bed, I sat on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the TV. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, but my mind was loud. I couldn't sleep. Thoughts kept swirling about the phone, the trips, the late nights. And then, as if compelled by some force outside of myself, I stood up and quietly walked to our bedroom. Melissa was fast asleep, her breathing steady and soft. I glanced at her suitcase, sitting innocently near the foot of the bed, and my heart pounded in my chest. I knew it was wrong, invading her privacy like this, but something inside me screamed for answers. I knelt beside the suitcase and slowly unzipped it, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and dread. At first, there was nothing unusual. Clothes folded neatly, a travel toiletry bag, a book. But then something caught my eye. Tucked into the corner of the suitcase was a small receipt, half hidden under one of her blouses. I pulled it out, the words Luxe Intimates printed boldly across the top. It was dated just a week ago, showing the purchase of several items, lingerie, to be exact. My chest tightened. I stood there, staring at the slip of paper as a cold wave of realization washed over me. Lingerie? Melissa hadn't worn lingerie around me in, well, I couldn't even remember the last time. And I certainly hadn't seen any of these items in our house. The receipt felt like a slap in the face, a stark reminder that there were things happening right under my nose that I didn't understand. I shoved the receipt back in her suitcase and quickly zipped it up, my hands trembling. I backed away from the bed, heart racing, 1,000 thoughts competing for space in my mind. Was I being ridiculous? Was this some innocent purchase, something she hadn't told me about yet? Or was this the confirmation of everything I'd been fearing for the past few months? I walked back to the living room and sank into the couch, staring at the clock as it ticked closer to midnight. For the first time, I felt something tangible, a piece of evidence, no matter how small, that my suspicions might not be paranoia after all. The next morning, as Melissa prepared to leave, I couldn't stop glancing at her suitcase, wondering if she knew I had been there. But she was her usual self, smiling and giving me a quick kiss before heading out the door. "I'll call you when I get there," she said over her shoulder, her voice light and casual. I nodded, watching her walk away. The image of that receipt burned into my mind. Something was happening, something more than just work trips and networking. And whatever it was, I was determined to find out. As Melissa's car disappeared down the street, I picked up my phone and texted Josh. He'd been my friend for years, the kind of guy who always had my back and never judged. "Hey, you free tonight? Need to talk about something." His response was quick. "Sure. Everything okay?" I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. Was everything okay? Not by a long shot. "I'll explain later." I typed back, hitting send before I could overthink it. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of all this. Because if the past few months had been a slow build of doubt, that little receipt had just detonated the first bomb. The day Melissa left for New York, my mind wouldn't let me rest. Every hour that passed brought more questions, more doubts, and an unbearable itch to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. I couldn't just sit in the house with this sinking feeling. I had to act, and I knew I couldn't do it alone. That evening, I met Josh at a small bar near Rittenhouse Square, a spot we'd frequented over the years for everything from celebrations to venting about life's frustrations. He was already there, sitting at our usual table, a pint of beer in front of him. Josh wasn't the type to overthink things, and maybe that's why I needed him now, to balance my spiraling thoughts with some practical advice. As soon as I sat down, he cut straight to the point. "All right, man, what's going on?" "You've been cagey all day," he said, leaning forward, his eyes locked on mine. I didn't sugarcoat it. I couldn't. I told him everything about the changes in Melissa's behavior, the constant texting, the late nights, and finally the lingerie receipt. The words spilled out of me, almost like I'd been waiting for someone to give me permission to acknowledge what I'd been denying for months. Josh listened, nodding occasionally, but staying silent until I finished. "That's rough," he finally said, rubbing his chin. "But it's not solid proof. It could still be something innocent. Lingerie? Maybe she was planning a surprise for you." I shook my head. "Nah, man. I know her. She hasn't worn anything like that for me in years. And that phone, she guards it like her life depends on it." Josh took a deep breath and leaned back, letting the weight of the situation settle in. "Okay, so what are you thinking? You've got to confront her eventually, right? But you sure you want to do this now, before you have all the facts?" I stared down at the table. "That's the thing. I don't want to just accuse her without knowing for sure. But I can't sit here and wait either." Josh raised an eyebrow. "You want to go up there, don't you?" I hesitated but nodded. "She's in Manhattan. It's only a 2-hour drive. I could check into the same hotel, see what's really going on. I need to catch her in the act if something's happening." Josh sighed, tapping his fingers on the edge of his beer glass. "All right, look, if you go up there, you need to keep your cool. You can't just barge in and start a fight. Get the facts first. Observe. And if it turns out she's cheating, you can confront her then. But don't do anything stupid. Okay?" His words were like a cold splash of reality. I knew he was right. Charging in, guns blazing, wouldn't solve anything. I needed to be smart about this. "I'll play it cool," I assured him. "I just need to see for myself. And if something's happening, I'll handle it." Josh studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, man. Just promise me you'll think this through. I've got your back, but don't let this destroy you." We left it at that. I knew Josh was trying to protect me from making things worse, but this wasn't something I could ignore anymore. The moment Melissa walked out the door that morning, something in me snapped. I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. The next morning, I packed a small bag and made the drive up to Manhattan. The city was its usual, chaotic self. Cabs honking, tourists wandering aimlessly, and the steady hum of people rushing to get somewhere. But as I pulled up to the luxury hotel where Melissa's conference was being held, the weight of what I was about to do hit me. I parked in the underground garage and sat there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding. This wasn't some paranoid fantasy anymore. I was here, about to confront the reality of my marriage. I checked into the hotel, giving the front desk a tight smile as they handed me my room key. I deliberately booked a room on the same floor as Melissa, floor 16. As the elevator carried me up, I couldn't help but wonder what she'd think if she saw me here. Would she be shocked, relieved, or would she panic, knowing her secret was about to unravel? The hallway was quiet when I stepped out of the elevator, a plush red carpet muffling my footsteps as I walked down toward my room. Melissa's room was just a few doors down, number 1624. I paused outside her door for a second, feeling the rush of adrenaline surge through me. But I kept walking, forcing myself to calm down. There was no point barging in without a plan. Once inside my own room, I tossed my bag onto the bed and pulled out my phone. I knew Melissa's schedule. She was supposed to be in a workshop all afternoon. I had time to think this through, but I didn't want to wait too long. If something was happening, I wanted to catch it now, before she had time to cover her tracks. I texted Josh, letting him know I'd arrived and was sticking to the plan. His reply was quick. Remember, keep calm. Get the facts first. I put my phone down and walked over to the window. The view was incredible. Manhattan stretched out beneath me, the skyline a mix of towering glass and steel. But none of that mattered right now. My focus was on the door a few rooms down. A few hours later, I finally worked up the nerve to head out. I knew Melissa would be back from her conference soon, and I couldn't sit in my room waiting for her to slip past. I needed to be out there, near her, observing. I walked down the hall and found a spot in the lounge just outside the elevators, pretending to read a magazine. It wasn't long before the elevator doors opened, and there she was. Melissa, looking as polished and professional as ever, a smile on her face as she chatted with a man beside her. I recognized him. One of her colleagues, Dylan, a real estate developer from Boston. I had seen him at one of her firm's parties months ago. But the way she laughed with him, that subtle, almost intimate smile, it was different. I kept my distance, watching as they parted ways, Melissa heading toward her room, Dylan walking in the opposite direction. She didn't notice me, which was good. I wasn't ready to reveal myself just yet. But then, as I followed her back to her door at a safe distance, something unexpected happened. Melissa stopped outside her room, pulled out her phone, and glanced at the screen. Her face changed. Her eyes darted to the left and right, checking if anyone was nearby. Then, I saw her typing quickly, a brief smile tugging at her lips before she slipped her phone into her bag and disappeared into her room. Curiosity burned inside me. I couldn't help it. I needed to know what she'd just seen. As I approached her door, pretending to pass by, I glanced inside through the small gap before it closed completely. Her phone screen was still lit on the table, and in that split second, I caught a glimpse of a message. Can't wait to see you later. Same room as last time. My stomach dropped. My hands clenched at my sides. There it was, the confirmation I'd been dreading. Whoever had sent that message wasn't part of her professional life. And same room as last time, this wasn't a one-time thing. I wanted to burst through the door, demand an explanation, confront her right then and there. But I stopped myself, heart pounding in my chest. No, I couldn't do that yet. I needed to gather more, figure out exactly what was going on before I made a move. Josh's words echoed in my head. Keep calm, get the facts. I backed away from the door, retreating to my own room. My mind raced, trying to process what I'd just seen. There was no denying it now. Melissa was hiding something, someone, but who? And how long had this been going on? I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the hotel phone, my pulse thundering in my ears. I had no appetite for dinner, but I knew I had to go through with it. After seeing that message on Melissa's phone, can't wait to see you later. Same room as last time. I was barely holding it together. My mind had been racing for hours. I'd spent the afternoon locked in my hotel room, pacing the floor, going over every detail in my head. There was no turning back now. Whatever was happening, it was real, and I needed to find out exactly what Melissa had been hiding. When I knocked on her door, Just after 7 p.m., she greeted me with that same radiant smile she always wore when she was in work mode. Her charm was turned on full blast, the kind of confidence that could make anyone in the room feel like they were the center of her attention. Except I wasn't fooled anymore. "Hey, you made it," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. There was warmth in her voice, but something about it felt forced, artificial. "I thought you might still be stuck in traffic." I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "Wanted to surprise you. Figured we could grab dinner together. Maybe catch up." "That sounds great." She stepped back into the room, motioning for me to follow. "Just give me a second to finish up here." As I entered, I noticed her suitcase still open on the floor, clothes neatly folded inside. The room looked immaculate, almost too perfect, like it had been staged for someone else's eyes. Melissa moved her laptop on the desk, typing away quickly. "Just sending off an email to a client," she explained, her back to me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my eyes scanning the room, trying to make sense of everything. Why was she acting so normal? Was she that confident I wouldn't find out? Or was there another explanation I hadn't considered? Within minutes, she shut the laptop and turned to me, her face lighting up. "All done. Ready?" "Yeah," I muttered, standing up. But as she moved past me toward the door, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. Her phone, left carelessly on the desk, lit up with a new message. "Looking forward to seeing you too." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my composure. It could have been anyone, but I knew better. That message wasn't from a coworker or a client. Whoever it was, they were planning on meeting her soon, maybe even tonight. But I couldn't react yet. I needed more. We ended up at the hotel restaurant downstairs. It was upscale, the kind of place where business professionals went to impress clients, and that only made me feel more out of place. We were seated by the window, the soft hum of quiet conversations filling the air around us. Melissa ordered a glass of white wine, while I stuck to water. The last thing I needed was alcohol clouding my judgment tonight. "So," she began, folding her hands on the table. "What's going on? You seem quiet." I forced a smile. "Long drive, I guess. Just tired." She studied me for a moment, as if trying to read my thoughts. Then, in a move that caught me completely off guard, she leaned forward and lowered her voice. "You don't have to worry about me, you know." My heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was she about to confess something? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say a word, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I mean it," she said softly. "I know I've been busy with work, and it feels like we've been off lately. But I'm here now. Let's make tonight about us, okay?" Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd been planning them for a while. But it wasn't the reassurance I was hoping for. If anything, it only made me more suspicious. If she truly believed nothing was wrong, why was she trying so hard to convince me? "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Let's do that." Dinner was awkward, to say the least. Melissa kept the conversation light, talking about her seminar, her clients, and a new property deal she was working on. I nodded along, barely listening, my mind focused entirely on what was happening behind the scenes. The message on her phone, the way she had looked at me when I arrived, it all pointed to something deeper, something I wasn't seeing yet. As the waiter cleared our plates, Melissa smiled at me, a playful glint in her eye. "You know," she said, "we haven't had a night alone like this in a long time." I forced a chuckle. "Yeah, it's been a while." She leaned closer, lowering her voice again. "Why don't we head back to my room? We can spend the night together. No distractions. Just you and me." Her words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. She was offering exactly what I wanted. Time alone with her, the chance to reconnect. But something about it felt wrong. It was too convenient, too perfect, especially after everything I'd seen. Still, I couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. "Sounds good," I said, pushing my chair back. "Let me just hit the restroom first. I'll meet you up there." She nodded, standing up from the table. "Room 1624. I'll see you soon." I walked to the bathroom with purpose, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed a moment to think, to gather myself before I did anything reckless. But as soon as I was alone in the small, dimly lit space, the doubts came rushing back. What was I doing? What was I even hoping to find? I splashed some cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me seemed tired, worn down by months of suspicion and paranoia. But this wasn't just in my head anymore. I had seen the messages. I had felt the distance growing between us. And now, I was on the verge of discovering the truth. I dried my hands and made my way back to the elevator, riding up to the 16th floor in silence. When I reached Melissa's room, the door was slightly ajar, as if she had left it open for me. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn shut, casting everything in a soft, warm glow. Melissa was in the bathroom, the sound of running water muffled through the closed door. I glanced around the room, taking it all in. Everything seemed normal. Her suitcase by the bed, her clothes neatly folded on a chair, her phone charging on the nightstand. But I wasn't here to admire the view. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to leave without them. I knelt down by her suitcase, my hands trembling slightly as I unzipped it. This time, I wasn't just looking for a receipt or a random clue. I needed something definitive, something that would confirm everything. At first, it was just clothes, blouses, pants, a pair of heels. But then, tucked away at the bottom of the bag, under a stack of neatly folded shirts, I found it. A small, discreet box of condoms. I froze, staring down at the box, as if it were some alien artifact I couldn't comprehend. We hadn't used condoms in years, not since I had the vasectomy. There was no reason for her to have them. No reason, except for one. My stomach churned, the realization hitting me like a freight train. Melissa wasn't just flirting, wasn't just texting some colleague late at night. She was cheating, and I had just found the proof. I slipped the box back into her bag, my mind racing. I couldn't confront her yet. Not like this. Not without a plan. I remembered Josh's advice. Keep calm, get the facts. But before I left the room, I did something I wasn't proud of. I pulled out one of the condoms, carefully unwrapping it, and used a safety pin I always carried to poke tiny holes through the center. It was petty, childish even, but it was my way of taking control of the situation. If she was going to betray me, I wasn't going to let her get away with it scot-free. Just as I finished, I heard the bathroom door creak open behind me. I stood up quickly, shoving the box back into the suitcase just as Melissa stepped into the room, her hair still wet from the shower, a towel wrapped around her. "All done?" she asked with a playful smile. I forced a grin, my heart still racing. "Yeah, just checking my phone." She crossed the room, leaning in to kiss me softly. "Good. Now, how about we make the most of this night?" I swallowed hard, nodding. "Sure, let's do that." But as we moved to the bed, the image of that box in her suitcase burned into my mind, a reminder of the secret she was still hiding from me. And I knew, even as I lay next to her, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As we walked out of the room the next morning, Melissa looking relaxed and carefree, I spotted Dylan waiting by the elevators. He grinned when he saw her, his eyes lighting up in a way that made my blood boil. "Looking forward to tomorrow's meeting," he said casually, giving me a quick nod before turning his attention back to her. Melissa smiled, but there was something in her eyes, something almost secretive. "Yeah, me too. Should be interesting." I clenched my fists, barely holding back the rage building inside me. It wasn't just about the condoms or the messages anymore. Dylan was the man she was meeting, the one she had been sneaking around with. And now I was sure of it. 2 days after the conference, Melissa returned home. If I had expected any change in her demeanor, any flicker of guilt or unease, I was sorely mistaken. She breezed in with the same energy she always had after one of her work trips, smiling as she dropped her suitcase in the hallway and called out to the kids. "Hey guys, Mommy's home," she shouted, her voice carrying through the house as Ava and Logan scrambled to greet her. I stood by the kitchen counter, watching as they embraced her, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Melissa looked so normal, so at ease, like the past few days hadn't meant anything. But for me, everything had changed. I couldn't look at her without thinking about the condoms in her suitcase, the message on her phone, or the way Dylan had smiled at her. I was drowning in my own suspicions, and Melissa was carrying on as if nothing had happened. Later that night, after we'd put the kids to bed, she came into the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine, as if this were just another quiet evening. I tried to act normal, tried to mask the anger simmering beneath the surface, but I could feel my resolve crumbling. "How was the conference?" I asked, forcing casualness into my tone. She smiled, leaning against the counter, taking a sip of her wine. "It was good. Productive. Made some great connections. I think the next few months are going to be really busy." I nodded, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling out of control. "That's great," I muttered, my voice hollow. Melissa took another sip, eyeing me over the rim of her glass. "You okay? You seem off." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question. Off? She was the one carrying on some affair behind my back, and I was supposed to act like everything was fine? But I bit my tongue, knowing that confronting her now, without concrete proof, would only blow up in my face. I couldn't afford that. Not yet. "Just tired," I said, brushing her off. The next day, Melissa mentioned the upcoming company picnic, a yearly event hosted at a lakeside resort just outside the city. She was excited about it, going on about how it would be good for the kids and how we could all enjoy a day out together. I played along, but inside I was still seething. The last thing I wanted was to spend the day pretending everything was fine, while Melissa mingled with her co-workers, including Dylan. But there was no way out of it. By the time we arrived at the resort that Saturday, the sun was high, and the air was thick with the smell of barbecue and sunscreen. The lakeside property was sprawling, with manicured lawns, picnic tables, and families spread out on blankets, kids running wild by the water. Melissa was in her element, laughing and chatting with her colleagues, while I trailed a few steps behind, trying to keep my head straight. As expected, Dylan was there too, mingling effortlessly with the crowd, flashing that same easy grin that had made my blood boil just a few days earlier. He was with a woman, tall, auburn hair, striking features, his wife Samantha. They looked every bit the perfect couple, though something about the way they interacted seemed off. There was a distance between them, like they were going through the motions but weren't really connected. I watched them from a distance, my mind racing. Did Samantha know? Or was she as oblivious as I had been? I tried to focus on the kids, Ava and Logan, who were chasing each other across the lawn, but my eyes kept drifting back to Dylan and Melissa. Every time they exchanged glances, even in passing, it felt like a dagger twisting deeper into my chest. Eventually, I found myself standing near the edge of the lake, away from the crowd, watching the water ripple lazily in the breeze. That's when I heard a voice behind me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I turned to see Samantha standing a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the water. Up close, she was even more striking, but there was something about her expression, something tired, weary, like she was carrying the weight of a secret she couldn't share. "Yeah," I muttered, unsure where this conversation was going. She looked at me, a faint smile on her lips. "We've met before, right? At one of these company events?" I nodded, though I barely remembered. "Yeah, I think so. Patrick." "Samantha," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her gaze steady. "You're Melissa's husband?" "Yeah." I didn't know what else to say. Small talk wasn't exactly my strong suit at the moment. She hesitated for a second, then tilted her head slightly. "You don't seem like you're enjoying yourself much." I forced a chuckle. "Just a lot on my mind, I guess." Samantha studied me for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was trying to figure something out. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "You know, don't you?" I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" She sighed, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "About Dylan. About Melissa." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I had already suspected it. Hearing it from someone else made it all too real. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "You know?" Samantha nodded, her expression unreadable. "I've known for a while. Dylan thinks he's being discreet, but he's not as clever as he thinks." I stared at her, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to deny it, to cling to the hope that maybe this was all a misunderstanding. But the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She had been living with this for longer than I had. "How long?" I finally asked. "A few months, at least," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe longer. I've suspected it before, but I didn't have proof until recently." I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest, but I pushed it down, keeping my focus on her. What kind of proof? Samantha hesitated for a moment, then looked around again, as if making sure no one else was listening. I hired a private investigator. I needed to know for sure. He followed Dylan, took pictures, recorded phone calls. I have everything. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Proof. Cold, hard evidence. That's what I had been missing. And now it was right in front of me. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice low. Because you deserve to know the truth, she replied, her gaze unwavering. And because I don't want to go through this alone. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Beneath the composed exterior, I could see the pain, the frustration, the same emotions I had been wrestling with for weeks. She was just as trapped as I was, caught in the same nightmare. Samantha took a deep breath, then continued. I'm planning to file for divorce, but I need everything in place first. My lawyer says the evidence I have will make the case airtight. But I thought maybe we could help each other. Help each other? I echoed, unsure of where she was going with this. She nodded. If we work together, we can make sure they don't get away with this. I can share the evidence with you, and you can use it however you need to. We don't have to face this alone. Her offer hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to jump at the chance, to finally have something solid, something undeniable that I could use against Melissa. But another part of me hesitated. Was I really ready to see the brutal reality of what had been happening behind my back? Samantha seemed to sense my hesitation. Look, I know this is a lot to process, but think about it. If you ever want to see the evidence, I'll show you. No pressure. I nodded slowly, still grappling with everything she had just told me. Thanks. She gave me a small, understanding smile. We'll get through this, Patrick. One way or another. As she turned and walked away, I stood there, staring out at the lake, my mind racing. The truth was out there, waiting for me. But did I really want to see it? Or was it better to keep pretending, to keep playing along, even though I knew deep down that my marriage was crumbling? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go on like this forever. That night, after we got home, I lay in bed next to Melissa, staring up at the ceiling. She was asleep, her breathing soft and steady, completely unaware of the conversation I had with Samantha earlier that day. The offer was still echoing in my mind. Samantha had laid it all out. Proof, cooperation, the chance to finally confront the truth. But taking that step meant there was no going back. Once I saw the evidence, once I had the facts laid bare, everything would change. I glanced over at Melissa, her face peaceful in the dim light. She had been acting so normal, so confident that I wouldn't find out. But now I had a choice to make. Did I really want to know the full extent of her betrayal? Or was I better off pretending, for the sake of the kids, for the sake of everything we had built? The choice weighed heavy on me, but deep down I knew the answer. I stood at Samantha's front door, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. It was strange being here. Her house was in one of those upscale Philadelphia suburbs, the kind of place where everything looked perfect on the surface. Manicured lawns, clean-cut hedges, and not a single thing out of place. But I knew what was waiting for me inside wasn't going to be neat or pretty. This was the moment I had been dreading, and yet I had to face it. Samantha answered the door before I even had the chance to knock. Her eyes met mine, and I could tell she was just as uneasy about this as I was. She gave me a tight smile and stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. Thanks for coming, she said quietly, closing the door behind me. I know this isn't easy. Yeah, I muttered, my voice hoarse. But I need to see it. She led me into the living room, which was just as polished as the outside of the house. Everything was perfectly arranged. Designer furniture, soft lighting, tasteful art on the walls. But all I could focus on was the laptop sitting on the coffee table, waiting for me. Samantha sat down on the couch, motioning for me to take the chair opposite her. The room was eerily quiet, the ticking of a nearby clock the only sound breaking the tension. I gathered everything, she said, her voice steady but strained. Photos, texts, phone records. It's all here. I swallowed hard, nodding. Okay, show me. She opened the laptop, the screen glowing in the dim light of the room. For a moment, she hesitated, her fingers hovering over the touchpad before she clicked open a folder labeled simply with the initials M and D. And then it began. The first image that filled the screen was a candid shot of Melissa and Dylan standing together outside some nondescript building, probably a hotel. They weren't holding hands, but the way they stood close to each other, the way they smiled, it was intimate, familiar. My stomach churned as I watched Samantha flip through a series of similar photos, each one worse than the last. There they were walking out of restaurants together, meeting in hotel lobbies, standing too close for it to be anything but what I feared. They looked like a couple, comfortable, at ease, like they'd done this 100 times before. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just Melissa, with that same charming smile she always wore when she was winning someone over. Except this time it wasn't me. These were taken over the last few months, Samantha said quietly, not looking at me. I didn't want to believe it at first. I hoped I was wrong. But well, here we are. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. There was no mistaking what this was. Melissa had been lying to me for months, maybe longer. Every time she'd gone on one of those work trips, every time she'd come home late with some excuse about meetings running long. It had all been a lie. And now, the proof was right in front of me. But it didn't stop there. Samantha opened another folder, this one containing screenshots of text messages between Melissa and Dylan. I braced myself as she clicked on the first one, the words jumping out at me like a punch to the gut. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. I'll book the same room as last time. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. More messages followed, each one worse than the last. It wasn't just casual flirting, it was full-blown planning, meeting up in secret, coordinating their schedules so they could spend time together without anyone knowing. Had a great time today. You always know how to make me smile. I felt sick. Every text was like a knife, twisting deeper, each one confirming the betrayal I had feared but hadn't wanted to believe. Samantha was silent as she flipped through the texts, giving me time to process. When she finally closed the laptop, she sat back, folding her hands in her lap. That's everything, she said softly. I've shown this to my lawyer. He says it's enough to build a solid case for divorce. But I wanted to show you first. I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. The photos, the texts, the meetings, it was all so clear now. Melissa hadn't just made a mistake. This wasn't a one-time thing. She had been seeing Dylan behind my back for months, maybe even longer, and I had been too blind to see it. How long do you think this has been going on? I finally asked, my voice barely audible. Samantha sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's hard to say. I started noticing things a few months ago, but it could have been longer. The investigator didn't catch everything, but from what we do have, it's clear they've been meeting regularly for at least 6 months. Maybe more. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of betrayal, of Melissa pretending that everything between us was fine while she was sneaking off with Dylan. I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me, but I pushed it down. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. What are you going to do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Samantha didn't hesitate. I'm filing for divorce. I can't stay in this marriage knowing what he's done. Not after everything. She paused, looking at me with a seriousness that cut through the haze of my thoughts. But I wanted to talk to you first. I think we should work together. Work together? I repeated, not quite understanding. She nodded, leaning forward slightly. We're both in the same situation. We both have spouses who have been lying to us, betraying us. If we confront them together, with all the evidence we have, we'll have the upper hand. They won't be able to weasel their way out of this. They'll have to face the consequences. Her plan made sense. Confronting them together would be a power move, something they wouldn't expect. But part of me hesitated. Could I really go through with this? Was I ready to pull the trigger on something that would shatter my life as I knew it? Samantha seemed to sense my hesitation. I know it's a lot to process, she said gently. But think about it. They've been meeting at Dylan's lake house. The same one where they hosted that company picnic. The place where we stood, talking, completely unaware of what they were doing behind our backs. That's where they've been having their little rendezvous. I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. The lake house? The one we'd just been at a few days ago? My stomach twisted at the thought of them sneaking off to that very place, pretending to be perfect spouses while they carried on their affair right under our noses. That's where they've been meeting? I asked, incredulous. Samantha nodded grimly. Every chance they get. I've seen the receipts. Dylan's been using it as their little getaway spot. It's disgusting. I sat back in the chair, running a hand through my hair, trying to make sense of it all. The pieces were falling into place, but they only made the picture uglier. Melissa and Dylan hadn't just been meeting up in hotels or sneaking around on work trips. They had been using a place that was supposed to be for family, for friends, a place where we had stood together, completely in the dark about what was really happening. How do we do it? I finally asked, my voice steely. Samantha's expression shifted, a flicker of determination in her eyes. We confront them together. At the lake house. Catch them in the act. I'll let Dylan think I'm out of town for the weekend. You do the same with Melissa. Then we show up, unannounced, with the evidence. I nodded, feeling the anger coiling tighter inside me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking control of the situation, about exposing the lies for what they were. Okay, I said, my voice firm. Let's do it. Samantha gave me a small, almost grim smile. Good. I'll set everything up. We'll do this right. As I stood to leave, she walked me to the door, pausing before I stepped outside. Patrick, she said quietly, I know this isn't easy, but we'll get through it. Together. I nodded, though the weight of what we were about to do still hung heavily in the air. This was it. The moment of truth was coming, and there was no turning back. As I walked to my car, the reality of what I had just agreed to hit me full force. In just a few days, everything would be laid bare. There would be no more secrets, no more lies. And when it was over, there would be nothing left to hide behind. Melissa and Dylan had made their choices. The drive to Dylan's lake house felt like an eternity, even though it was less than an hour outside of the city. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white, as I replayed the plan over and over in my head. Samantha and I had gone over every detail in the days leading up to this. She had made sure Dylan thought she was out of town, and I had told Melissa I'd be taking the kids to visit my parents for the weekend. Everything was in place. All we had to do now was confront them. But as I neared the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that once we crossed this line, there was no going back. Samantha was already waiting when I arrived. Her car was parked off to the side of the gravel road, hidden in the trees, just as we had planned. I pulled in beside her and got out, the crunch of gravel under my feet sounding louder than it should in the quiet, empty surroundings. The lake was serene, the kind of picturesque place where you'd imagine people coming to relax, not to uncover the wreckage of their marriages. Samantha stood by her car, arms crossed, her face set in a grim expression. She nodded at me when I approached, but there were no words. We didn't need them. The tension between us was thick, charged with everything that was about to unfold. She gestured toward the house, and I followed her lead as we made our way through the trees, taking the back path that led to a side entrance. The house itself was a sprawling structure, set back from the lake, its large windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. The porch wrapped around the front, and from our vantage point, we could see the sleek black SUV parked near the driveway. Dylan's car. My heart pounded in my chest as we approached, the blood rushing in my ears. The plan was simple. Catch them in the act, confront them with the evidence, and hand them the divorce papers. But simple didn't mean easy. There was still a part of me that couldn't believe I was about to do this. To confront Melissa, the woman I'd spent the last 15 years of my life with, and to expose her betrayal in such a cold, calculated way. But there was no other choice now. Samantha moved ahead of me, her hand reaching for the door handle. We had agreed to enter quietly, to catch them off guard. As the door creaked open, the sound of muted voices drifted toward us from inside. My stomach tightened, a knot of rage and disbelief twisting inside me. Though they were completely unaware of what was about to hit them. We stepped inside, the cool air of the house hitting us as we moved through the hallway, making our way toward the living room. I could hear them clearly now, Melissa's laugh, light and carefree, like she didn't have a care in the world. And then Dylan's voice, deep and smooth, like nothing about this situation was wrong. The moment we rounded the corner, I saw them. Melissa was sitting on the couch, her legs casually draped over Dylan's lap as he leaned back, one arm stretched out behind her. They were so comfortable, so at ease, it made my skin crawl. Melissa's phone was on the coffee table in front of them, and she was mid-laugh when she caught sight of us. For a split second, her face froze, the smile dying on her lips as her eyes widened in shock. She bolted upright, pulling her legs off Dylan's lap, and her hand instinctively reached for her phone. "Patrick? What are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice high-pitched and panicked. Dylan, to his credit, didn't say a word. He just sat there, his body tensing as his eyes flicked between me and Samantha. The room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice low, barely containing the fury bubbling just beneath the surface. "What the hell do you think I'm doing here, Melissa?" She stood up, her hands trembling, as she tried to find the right words. It's not what it looks like." Samantha stepped forward, her voice cold and calm. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like, Melissa." I pulled the manila envelope from my jacket, my hands shaking with adrenaline, and tossed it onto the coffee table in front of them. "These are divorce papers," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside me. "You can sign them, or we can go to court. Either way, this is over." Melissa's face drained of color as she stared at the envelope. Dylan finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "You don't have to do this. We can talk about this like adults." "Like adults?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You've been sneaking around with my wife for months, and you want to talk about being adults?" Dylan stood up, his body rigid, his face hardening as he stepped toward me. "Patrick, calm down. We don't have to make this ugly." "Oh, it's already ugly," Samantha said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She stepped forward, crossing her arms, staring Dylan down. "And you're going to pay for it." Melissa, still reeling from the shock, shook her head. "Patrick, listen. This doesn't have to end like this. We can fix this. Please don't do this." "Fix this?" I laughed bitterly, the sound escaping me before I could stop it. "You've been lying to me for months, Melissa. You've been sneaking around, meeting him here at this lake house. You think this is something we can just fix?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't buying the performance. I had seen enough, heard enough. There was no going back. Just as I turned to leave, Dylan's voice cut through the air, sharp and angry. "This is all your fault, Melissa." The accusation hung in the air, and I turned back in time to see the shift in his posture, the anger rising in him. He took a step toward Melissa, but then his eyes flicked to me. "And why don't you just walk away? This doesn't concern you anymore." I felt the heat of rage flare inside me, but I kept my cool. "It concerns me when you've been screwing my wife." Dylan's face twisted with fury, and in a split second, everything changed. He lunged at me, his hands outstretched, trying to shove me backward. But I wasn't about to let him get the upper hand. I stood my ground, grabbing his wrists, pushing back with all the force I had. We struggled for a few seconds, the room erupting into chaos as Samantha screamed for us to stop. But in the heat of the moment, Dylan lost his footing, his heel catching on the edge of the rug. He fell backward, crashing into the coffee table with a sickening thud as his head collided with the corner of the fireplace. For a moment, everything went still. The only sound was the harsh, uneven breathing in the room. Dylan lay motionless on the floor, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. Samantha rushed forward, her phone already in her hand, dialing 911. "Dylan!" she cried, her voice panicked as she knelt beside him. I stood frozen, my heart racing, unable to process what had just happened. It wasn't supposed to go like this. It was just supposed to be a confrontation, a chance to expose the truth. Not this. The paramedics arrived within minutes, the flashing lights of the ambulance casting eerie shadows across the lake as they loaded Dylan onto a stretcher, blood staining the front of his shirt. I stood to the side, numb, watching as they wheeled him out of the house. Samantha was talking to the police, explaining what had happened, but I could barely hear her. Everything felt distant, surreal. One of the officers approached me, his expression serious. "It looks like an accident," he said. "Self-defense, given the circumstances. But we'll need to take statements from everyone." I nodded, barely able to muster a response. The reality of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in yet. Dylan was being taken to the hospital with a concussion, maybe worse. And while it wasn't my fault, he had come at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this had all spiraled out of control. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. Dylan's injuries, while not life-threatening, were serious enough to keep him out of work for weeks. And Samantha wasted no time using the incident to her advantage. Her lawyer had a field day with the police reports and the evidence of Dylan's violent outburst, painting him as emotionally unstable and a danger to those around him. Dylan's company, already reeling from the scandal of the affair, decided to cut ties with him completely. The lawsuit Samantha filed for emotional damages was the final nail in the coffin. He was left with nothing, no job, no reputation, and a mountain of medical bills. Melissa, on the other hand, tried to reach out to me several times in the days after the confrontation. She left voicemails, sent texts, pleading with me to talk, to let her explain. But I wasn't interested in hearing her lies anymore. The divorce papers were already in motion, and there was no salvaging what she had destroyed. In the end, Dylan and Melissa had built their relationship on lies and deceit, and it had come crashing down around them. Meanwhile, Samantha and I had come out of the fire stronger, united in our resolve to move on, to rebuild our lives without the weight of betrayal dragging us down. The truth had come out, and in the end, it was more powerful than any of us could have imagined. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to the channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story.